11th century, a time of shifting loyalties, brutal battles, and royal ambition, was born a boy who would become one of England's most methodical and calculating monarchs. King Henry I, later nicknamed Beauclerc for his scholarly education, was born sometime around 1068, the youngest son of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders. The exact location remains uncertain, though it is generally believed to have been in Selby, Yorkshire, making him the only son of William likely born in England. Henry's birth positioned him far from the throne. As the fourth and youngest son, he had little realistic prospect of ruling. Sons of kings were not raised for kindness or comfort, they were brought up as weapons for power. Yet Henry's path would be shaped not solely by blood or birthright, but by his keen intellect, opportunism, and an iron will to govern. His father William, who had seized England in 1066 after the Battle of Hastings, intended his three oldest sons to govern the realms of the Anglo-Norman Empire. Robert Curthose, the eldest, was to receive Normandy. William Rufus would take England. The third son, Richard, died young in a hunting accident. That left Henry with no predefined inheritance. Instead, he was offered a sum of money, £5,000 in silver, to carve his own future. It was both a gift and a challenge. Unlike many of his brutish contemporaries, Henry was educated in Latin, logic, rhetoric, and possibly even some Greek. He was unusually literate for a nobleman, much less a king, and his passion for law and orderly governance would form the backbone of his later reign. These attributes gave him the moniker Beauclerc, meaning fine scholar. But youth was not spared violence. As the sons of William jostled for power, the Anglo-Norman realm became fractured. Upon William the Conqueror's death in 1087, Henry rushed to secure lands and titles while the kingdom passed to his bolder brothers. Robert inherited Normandy, while William Rufus, known for his fiery temper and flamboyant rule, became King of England. Henry attempted to position himself between them, sometimes siding with Rufus, other times with Robert, depending on opportunity. One such moment arose when he bought the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy from Robert. But when the alliance frayed, Robert expelled him. Henry, stateless and unwelcome, wandered Normandy, earning support among local lords and laying the groundwork for future power. He bided his time, cultivating allies, leveraging his education, and building a reputation for reason and justice. His political enemies may have called him calculating, his allies pragmatic. Either way, he was patient. By 1191, Henry had returned to England, his fortunes slowly recovering. He often played peacemaker between his combative brothers, but this did little to diminish his ambition. Year after year, he watched as William Rufus's increasingly tyrannical reign stirred unrest. William's contentious relationship with the church and his magnates marked his kingship with tension. His sudden and suspicious death in 1100, struck down by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest, sent ripples of both grief and opportunity through the nobility. Henry was there, and he acted swiftly. Some say William's death was an accident, others whisper of darker plots. But no matter the truth, Henry wasted no time. While Robert Curthose lingered in the Holy Land on crusade, Henry raced to seize the crown. Within days, on August 5th, 1100, he was hastily crowned at Westminster Abbey by the Bishop of London, securing his authority in the absence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was exiled at the time. To win the favour of both church and barons, Henry issued a document known as the Charter of Liberties, where he pledged to end the abuses of his brother's reign. He promised to reform the royal court, rekindle justice, and honour the church. It was a public declaration of reform, perhaps the first royal attempt at a social contract in English history. But legitimacy required more than promises. It needed bloodlines. And so, Henry made a politically savvy move. He married Edith of Scotland, a princess descended from both the Anglo-Saxon kings and the famed King Edmund Ironside. Renamed Matilda upon marriage, she became a powerful symbol of unity between the old Anglo-Saxon order and the Norman conquerors. Their union was meant to solidify his claim in the eyes of both Norman barons and English subjects. Still, Robert Curthose had not yet returned. When he did, he brought with him the aura of a crusader, a hero who had fought bravely in the Holy Land and returned tempered by sacred purpose. Many believed he might contest Henry's claim. And indeed in 1101 Robert landed in England with an army, yet no battle followed. Through negotiation, bribery, and diplomacy, Henry convinced Robert to withdraw peacefully, ceding his claim for now. But even reconciliations have their limits. The final reckoning between the brothers would come a few years later on the fields of Tinchebrai in the heart of Normandy. There, in 1106, Henry would lead a campaign that would not just secure his crown but cement his legacy. But for now, Henry was king. Though young, unproven, and absent in the succession line, he had seized the throne unchallenged by bloodshed, governed through tactics more than force, and inaugurated a reign that would leave a lasting legal and administrative legacy on all of England. Though Henry I was crowned swiftly in 1100, the golden circlet placed on his head did not alone guarantee peace. In the immediate aftermath of his brother William Rufus's dramatic death, Henry had to navigate treacherous waters. His grip on power was unsteady, his legitimacy questioned, and his half-brother Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy and seasoned crusader, loomed as a threat with a stronger claim by primogeniture. Though Henry had the crown, Robert had the right, or so many believed, and so the young king went to work. His aim, to secure his rule not just with military might, but through strategic rebellion management and deft diplomacy. First, he turned inward. He knew that his brother William's tyrannical reign had disillusioned both the barons and the church. To win hearts and minds, Henry had issued the Charter of Liberties upon his coronation, a bold promise to end the arbitrary rule under which barons had suffered. It was a calculated pledge to restore traditional laws and customs, to protect widows' rights, to refrain from exploitative taxation, and to respect the independence of the church. This document was not merely symbolic, it was a powerful stroke to calm the nobility and unite them around a new idealized vision of the monarchy. But pledges could only go so far. In 1101, Robert Curthose, flush with confidence from his exploits during the First Crusade, returned to Europe. With supporters among the Norman aristocracy in England, he landed at Portsmouth with an army and challenged his younger brother for the crown of England. Many nobles stood poised to defect, uncertain of Henry's ability to keep his promises or to keep power. But once again, Henry showed the guile that would define his reign. Rather than risk open war, he opened negotiations. Perhaps he admired Robert's valour and experience. Perhaps he simply understood that Robert was a poor administrator and a disorganized leader. Using both diplomacy and bribes, Henry brokered the Treaty of Alton, by which Robert agreed to renounce his claims to the English throne in exchange for a yearly pension and some territorial compensations. Peace was achieved, but it was a peace laced with powder. Rebels in England who had hoped for Robert's success were now seen as traitors. Henry acted decisively. Several leading nobles were arrested and their lands confiscated. The message was clear. Henry would reward loyalty and crush sedition. The monarchy, under his steady hand, was no longer the gambling hall of squabbling brothers. It was to be a fortress of institutional control. Over the next several years, Henry began consolidating that power. He refortified his alliances with powerful barons and continued cultivating support among the church. Most notably, he brought back Anselm, the revered Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been exiled during William Rufus's reign. The relationship between king and archbishop would be rocky at times, but the message was symbolic. Under Henry, the spiritual and royal authorities would not be in constant strife. The chaos of Rufus's irreligious court was over, but Henry knew that so long as Robert controlled Normandy, a dagger lingered at England's throat. Not only were Norman barons split in their loyalties, but Normandy itself provided a potential launching ground for rivals to stage invasions. England and Normandy were siblings divided by politics, tightly entwined in blood and land. And so, in 1105, Henry crossed the Channel, ready for confrontation. Robert's rule in Normandy had dissolved into disarray. The great crusader, despite his heroism in the Holy Land, had proven a weak leader. Lawlessness consumed the duchy. Barons rebelled with impunity. Towns suffered under sporadic governance. Henry seized the opportunity. His campaign was part military, part diplomatic. He wooed Norman nobles who had grown tired of Robert's ineffectiveness. Bit by bit, he chipped away at Robert's support, brushing aside small armies and striking modest towns until, in 1106, the final clash erupted at the fortified hilltop of Tinchebrai. On September 28th of that year, Henry's forces met Robert's in open combat. By then, Henry had spent 6 years strengthening his rule, refining his military command and unifying his backers. Robert, ever impulsive and lacking discipline among his ranks, fell into Henry's trap. The battle itself was short, but decisive. Henry was victorious. Robert Curthose was taken prisoner. Henry had not merely defeated a rival. He had accomplished something far grander. He had reunited England and Normandy under one crown for the first time since his father's death. And yet, the fate he assigned to his brother was no small matter. Rather than execution, Henry imprisoned Robert for the rest of his life, nearly 28 years of confinement in various castles. Some say this was Henry's greatest act of mercy. Others saw it as ruthlessly efficient. But one thing was clear: there would be no second rebellion from Robert. The threat was neutralized. Now, in total control of England and Normandy, Henry shifted his focus from competition to consolidation. He brought English-style administration into Normandy and ensured that loyalists staffed key positions of power on both sides of the Channel. He appointed justiciars, sheriffs, and clerks who would carry his will to every corner of the realm. Personal friendship mattered less than loyalty and competence. Slowly but surely, the feudal squabbles that plagued his early reign gave way to a new stability, one undergirded by law, bureaucracy, and an increasingly centralized monarchy. Henry's his rule was transforming the very nature of kingship. No longer a figurehead amidst warring nobles or one step ahead of his rivals, he now stood as a monarch in full command, enthroned not by divine inheritance alone, but by strategy, reform, and the art of calculated diplomacy. The age of conquest had given way to the age of governance, and yet Henry had only begun to reshape the kingdom in his image. King Henry I was not a flamboyant warrior like his father, William the Conqueror, nor a reckless adventurer like his brother Robert. His genius was administrative. Where others ruled with swords and spectacle, Henry ruled with parchment, law, and ledger. Under his hand, England, and later Normandy, underwent a quiet revolution not of conquests, but of systems. This was the creation of a monarchy that endured beyond kings, dependable, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly efficient. At the heart of this transformation was Henry's belief that good governance required order, predictability, and swift justice. Born the son of a conqueror, but possessing the mind of a logician, Henry built what some historians call medieval England's first serious civil service. He transformed the royal household from a chaotic body of noble favourites into a hub of trained clerks and officials, many of whom were drawn from the church, educated, obedient men who could write, reckon, and record. One of his most influential innovations was the development of the exchequer. While some early form of royal revenue accounting existed in his predecessors' reigns, Henry formalized and expanded it. The exchequer was both a physical place and a process. A large checkered cloth like a chessboard was spread over a table, and counters were used to perform complex calculations for auditing sheriffs and royal officials. Twice a year, sheriffs were summoned to account for the taxes collected in their shires. These sessions were recorded on great pipe rolls, starting as early as 1129, which survive to this day as some of the earliest fiscal records in Europe. With these reforms, the flow of royal income became more predictable. Land taxes, fees, and fines were not merely extracted through coercion, but monitored and tracked through a comprehensive system. In Henry's realm, money talked, and the king's officials listened carefully. This drive for financial stability empowered Henry to do something critical: reduce his reliance on feudal levies and baronial loyalty. He could hire mercenaries, fund garrisons, and maintain authority without constant campaigning or placating rebel lords. In this way, the king secured his independence from potentially rebellious nobles, and England itself began its slow evolution into a state ruled by law, rather than baronial whim. Even more transformative was Henry's overhaul of the justice system. To the people, commoners and nobles alike, Henry presented himself as the guarantor of fairness in an unfair world. He was deeply invested in the royal prerogative of justice. It wasn't enough that the king's law existed, it had to be seen working. Henry sent justices throughout the kingdom, bringing heirs or royal court sessions directly to the shires. These circuit courts were staffed not by local lords with private interests, but by trained officials representing the crown. Crimes and property disputes once handled in manorial courts biased by noble influence increasingly came under the king's purview. By extending royal jurisdiction, Henry weakened the traditional power of local barons. The message was clear. Justice flowed not from a noble sword, but from the king's voice. Even the church, that mighty landowner and fount of moral authority, found itself reined in. During the investiture controversy, the long-running European dispute over whether kings or popes could appoint bishops, Henry took a uniquely English approach. When confronted by the upright Archbishop Anselm in 1105, Henry negotiated rather than defied Rome. In a landmark settlement, he conceded that bishops would be chosen by the church but invested with lands and regalia by the king. This compromise preserved royal control over vital appointments while appearing to respect ecclesiastical autonomy. Henry understood optics as well as leverage. He honored the church just enough to maintain his image as a pious king, but never surrendered the real levers of power. Even his illegitimate children found high offices or marriages within strategic families, showing that Henry's vision of rule extended into dynastic infrastructure. Yet the king's appetite for order and management extended far beyond London. In Normandy, after capturing the duchy from his brother Robert, Henry exported his English administrative model abroad. He introduced sheriffs, fiscal oversight, and stronger ducal courts, norms long absent in the more feudalized and loosely governed duchy. His Norman subjects, initially wary of English intrusion, came to recognize the benefits of regular justice and stable taxation. Henry even took direct interest in supervising local officials, a rarity at the time. Chroniclers note that he would interrogate sheriffs and ministers himself, demonstrating an uncanny attention to truth and propriety. In one account, upon discovering that a favored minister had grown suspiciously wealthy, Henry remarked with sardonic gravity, "I have raised you from the mud, I will return you to it." And so he did, dismissing the official, seizing his estates, and making an example of corruption. Under Henry, loyalty mattered, but competence mattered more. He appointed men of low birth to high office if they had proven skill. These were often new men, a term historians use to describe royal servants who rose through merit rather than lineage. Knights, clerks, and even commoners found themselves running castles, courts, and chanceries. To the aristocracy, this shift was sometimes threatening. To the king, it was progress. And so, Henry I laid the groundwork for a centralized English monarchy, a striking contrast to the fragmented kingdoms of France or the Holy Roman Empire. With coinage reforms, legal standardization, and calculated appointments, he made himself not only ruler by title, but ruler in practice. He didn't claim divine right to do as he pleased. Instead, he pursued the divine order as he defined it, a world shaped by law, accountability, and systemic control. For the common man, Henry's reign was often a mixed blessing. Taxes were heavy, but so were protections. The same king who confiscated estates with iron resolve also hung thieves by the dozen to make roads safer. He was harsh, but he was just. He would rather have peace by fear than chaos by love. This powerful administrative legacy would endure far beyond his death, informing the legal traditions and royal customs of England for generations. In fact, many of Henry's bureaucratic innovations laid the intellectual foundation for later advances during the reigns of his grandson Henry II and the evolution of English common law. In an age of iron fists and shifting loyalties, Henry ruled with pen, parchment, and precision, and in doing so, became not only a medieval monarch, but a modernizer in a world that barely understood the word. Despite his reputation as an administrative genius and a ruler of cold efficiency, King Henry I was a man of striking personal complexity. Behind the walls of his royal courts and administrative reforms lay a monarch whose private life reflected both dynastic ambition and human vulnerability. He was a ruler in constant pursuit of control, but fate, as it so often does, would ultimately prove his limits. Nowhere is this tension between power and fragility clearer than in Henry's relationships with his children, his wives, and the tragic events aboard the White Ship. Henry's first and most politically strategic marriage was to Matilda of Scotland, née Edith, the daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and St. Margaret of Wessex. Their union in 1100 served as more than a royal partnership. It was political theatre with substance. Through Matilda, Henry gained a vital link to the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, soothing native English fears about Norman rule. She symbolized continuity in a kingdom still adjusting to conquest and foreign kings. Matilda bore Henry 2 children in the early years of their reign, a son named William Adelin in 1103 and a daughter, Matilda, in 1102. William was the pride of the realm, styled as Adelin from the Latin Adelinus, meaning noble or princely. He was raised with every expectation of rule, groomed by tutors, trained as a knight, and betrothed to Matilda of Anjou to cement alliance with one of France's most powerful noble houses. As for the daughter, Lady Matilda, later known as Empress Matilda, her path, though initially less significant in the eyes of her contemporaries, would prove epoch-defining. But Henry was not content with a narrow legacy. He fathered more illegitimate children than any other English monarch. Estimates suggest over 20, perhaps as many as 25. These children were born to noble women, courtesans, and household staff, and rather than shun them, Henry often acknowledged and supported them. Sons were trained for military or clerical careers. Daughters were married off to powerful allies. They were pawns and tools, yes, but also connections, tethers to the sprawling net of loyalty and influence that Henry wove across his kingdoms. Among the most prominent of his illegitimate issue was Robert of Gloucester, a steady and deeply loyal figure who would later become a central military leader in one of England's most troubled eras. Despite his bastard status, Henry trusted Robert deeply, and it is often said that Henry's love for his illegitimate sons sometimes exceeded the cold political affection he showed his lawful heir. But even the most carefully cultivated legacies hang by a single thread. In 1118, Queen Matilda died, aged perhaps in her early 40s. Her death removed not only a devoted companion, but also the symbolic figurehead of Henry's dynastic legitimacy. Though deeply affected, the king did not remain long a widower. In 1121 he married Adeliza of Louvain, a beautiful and noble young woman famed for her piety and grace. Their marriage, however, produced no children, despite over a decade together, and the absence of a new male heir left William Adelin all the more central to the English future. That future would die at sea. In November of 1120, Henry and his court were returning from Normandy to England after securing terms with King Louis VI of France regarding William's future dukedom of Normandy. William, now 17 years old, charismatic and well-liked, was preparing to rule alongside his father in the continental territories. Henry had secured oaths of vassalage from Norman barons and had even arranged for his son's half-siblings to hold land and titles to support the realm. Everything, it seemed, was in place. But as often happens in moments of overconfidence, a great and terrible oversight was made. William, along with several high-ranking nobles, including many of Henry's illegitimate children, took passage aboard the White Ship, a sleek, fast vessel commanded by the son of the royal fleet master. The ship's captain, eager to impress, delayed departure to allow William and his companions to drink and revel on shore. By the time the ship finally departed Barfleur, it was night, and the crew was thoroughly inebriated. The waters of the English Channel were treacherous in darkness. Within moments of departure, the White Ship struck a submerged rock known to locals but easily missed without caution. The hull tore open. Icy water poured in. Panic erupted. William, it is said, initially escaped in a lifeboat, but turned back upon hearing the screams of his half-sister, Countess Matilda. That act of compassion cost him everything. The lifeboat was swamped by desperate survivors, and all aboard drowned. Only one person survived, Berold, a butcher from Rouen, who clung to a floating mast and lived to tell the tale. When Henry heard the news, he reportedly collapsed in grief. No man, wrote a chronicler, ever suffered more anguish. For all his cold resolve and administrative brilliance, nothing could shield him from the brutal, abrupt collapse of his dynastic hopes. He had poured his reign into order, into succession, into securing his line, only to watch it vanish beneath the waves. The political consequences were just as severe. Suddenly, Henry had no legitimate male heir. The web of alliances, oaths, and expectations delicately constructed over 2 decades began to unravel. Rival claimants emerged. Foreign powers sensed weakness. The question arose, who would rule after Henry? In a move unprecedented and controversial, Henry did something remarkable. He designated his daughter Matilda as his heir. She had once been the wife of Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and was now a widow of powerful lineage and commanding presence. In 1127, Henry summoned his barons and made them swear fealty to her as his successor. But even in this, doubt festered. Though Matilda was royal, she was a woman in a male-dominated world. Many nobles took the oath with crossed fingers behind their backs, secretly praying for a male solution to present itself. It never did, not from Henry, at least. The White Ship disaster marked more than the loss of a single prince. It was the death knell for the tidy legacy Henry had fought so hard to build. Try as he might in later years, the ghost of that ship and the air it carried would cast a shadow across the final decade of his reign and into the storm of civil war that would follow. Despite his reputation as an administrative genius and a ruler of cold efficiency, King Henry I was a man of striking personal complexity. Behind the walls of his royal courts and administrative reforms lay a monarch whose private life reflected both dynastic ambition and human vulnerability. He was a ruler in constant pursuit of control, but fate, as it so often does, would ultimately prove his limits. Nowhere is this tension between power and fragility clearer than in Henry's relationships with his children, his wives, and the tragic events aboard the White Ship. Henry's first and most politically strategic marriage was to Matilda of Scotland, née Edith, the daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and St. Margaret of Wessex. Their union in 1100 served as more than a royal partnership. It was political theatre with substance. Through Matilda, Henry gained a vital link to the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, soothing native English fears about Norman rule. She symbolized continuity in a kingdom still adjusting to conquest and foreign kings. Matilda bore Henry 2 a son named William Adelin in 1103 and a daughter Matilda in 1102. William was the pride of the realm, styled as Adeline from the Latin adelinus, meaning noble or princely. He was raised with every expectation of rule, groomed by tutors, trained as a knight, and betrothed to Matilda of Anjou to cement alliance with one of France's most powerful noble houses. As for the daughter, Lady Matilda, later known as Empress Matilda, her path, though initially less significant in the eyes of her contemporaries, would prove epoch-defining. But Henry was not content with a narrow legacy. He fathered more illegitimate children than any other English monarch. Estimates suggest over 20, perhaps as many as 25. These children were born to noble women, courtesans, and household staff, and rather than shun them, Henry often acknowledged and supported them. Sons were trained for military or clerical careers. Daughters were married off to powerful allies. They were pawns and tools, yes, but also connections, tethers to the sprawling net of loyalty and influence that Henry wove across his kingdoms. Among the most prominent of his illegitimate issue was Robert of Gloucester, a steady and deeply loyal figure who would later become a central military leader in one of England's most troubled eras. Despite his bastard status, Henry trusted Robert deeply, and it is often said that Henry's love for his illegitimate sons sometimes exceeded the cold political affection he showed his lawful heir. But even the most carefully cultivated legacies hang by a single thread. In 1118, Queen Matilda died, aged perhaps in her early 40s. Her death removed not only a devoted companion, but also the symbolic figurehead of Henry's dynastic legitimacy. Though deeply affected, the king did not remain long a widower. In 1121, he married Adeliza of Louvain, a beautiful and noble young woman famed for her piety and grace. Their marriage, however, produced no children despite over a decade together, and the absence of a new male heir left William Adelin all the more central to the English future. That future would die at sea. In November of 1120, Henry and his court were returning from Normandy to England after securing terms with King Louis VI of France regarding William's future dukedom of Normandy. William, now 17 years old, charismatic and well-liked, was preparing to rule alongside his father in the continental territories. Henry had secured oaths of vassalage from Norman barons and had even arranged for his son's half-siblings to hold land and titles to support the realm. Everything, it seemed, was in place. But as often happens in moments of overconfidence, a great and terrible oversight was made. William, along with several high-ranking nobles, including many of Henry's illegitimate children, took passage aboard the White Ship, a sleek, fast vessel commanded by the son of the royal fleet master. The ship's captain, eager to impress, delayed departure to allow William and his companions to drink and revel on shore. By the time the ship finally departed Barfleur, it was night and the crew was thoroughly inebriated. The waters of the English Channel were treacherous in darkness. Within moments of departure, the White Ship struck a submerged rock known to locals but easily missed without caution. The hull tore open. Icy water poured in. Panic erupted. William, it is said, initially escaped in a lifeboat, but turned back upon hearing the screams of his half-sister, Countess Matilda. That act of compassion cost him everything. The lifeboat was swamped by desperate survivors and all aboard drowned. Only one person survived, Berold, a butcher from Rouen who clung to a floating mast and lived to tell the tale. When Henry heard the news, he reportedly collapsed in grief. "No man," wrote a chronicler, "ever suffered more anguish." For all his cold resolve and administrative brilliance, nothing could shield him from the brutal, abrupt collapse of his dynastic hopes. He had poured his reign into order, into succession, into securing his line, only to watch it vanish beneath the waves. The political consequences were just as severe. Suddenly, Henry had no legitimate male heir. The web of alliances, oaths, and expectations delicately constructed over 2 decades began to unravel. Rival claimants emerged. Foreign powers sensed weakness. The question arose, who would rule after Henry? In a move unprecedented and controversial, Henry did something remarkable. He designated his daughter Matilda as his heir. She had once been the wife of Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and was now a widow of powerful lineage and commanding presence. In 1127, Henry summoned his barons and made them swear fealty to her as his successor. But even in this, doubt festered. Though Matilda was royal, she was a woman in a male-dominated world. Many nobles took the oath with crossed fingers behind their backs, secretly praying for a male solution to present itself. It never did, not from Henry, at least. The White Ship disaster marked more than the loss of a single prince. It was the death knell for the tidy legacy Henry had fought so hard to build. Try as he might in later years, the ghost of that ship and the air it carried would cast a shadow across the final decade of his reign and into the storm of civil war that would follow. When King Henry I breathed his last on December 1st, 1135, in the quiet seclusion of Lyons-la-Forêt, the weight of nearly 4 decades of rule did not die with him. It cascaded into the hands of a kingdom unprepared for the vacuum his absence would create. Despite every charter he had issued, every oath he had demanded, and every alliance he had forged, the delicate facade of a stable succession crumbled almost instantly. In theory, Henry's death should not have initiated a crisis. The barons had sworn, twice and in formal ceremony, to accept his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as their rightful liege. By royal decree, she had been named heir. She was not only the daughter of a king, but the widow of a Holy Roman Emperor, and the wife of Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. But in practice, Matilda was hundreds of miles away in Normandy, pregnant with her 3rd son. She was not in England, and in the Middle Ages, legitimacy moved quickly and often rode on horseback. Into this breathless vacuum stepped Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. He was not the first in line, nor the best suited by law, but Stephen had something Matilda lacked: immediate access to the throne and the charisma to win powerful allies quickly. Barely 2 weeks after Henry's burial, Stephen crossed from Boulogne to England under the pretense of securing the realm. Once in London, he made his claim. Some nobles were taken aback, but more importantly, some were relieved. They feared the idea of a woman ruling, and with her the embrace of foreign Angevins, old enemies of the Normans. The tide turned in Stephen's favour, not through strength of bloodline, but through speed and opportunism. By late December he was crowned King Stephen at Westminster Abbey. Aubrey de Vere, the Lord Chamberlain, placed the crown on his head. The royal court acknowledged him. Most of the bishops blessed the move, including Henry's old ally, Roger of Salisbury, the king's former chancellor. By the new year, Matilda's hard-won inheritance was a flickering candle, easily snuffed. When word of Stephen's coronation reached Normandy, Matilda was stunned. but not crushed. She had known that opposition to her rule would eventually come, though perhaps not with such betrayal. Her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, remained loyal, as did a scattering of barons throughout England. But for the moment, Stephen sat on the throne. A long and uncertain struggle had begun. Thus began the period known to history as the Anarchy, a 19-year civil war marked by shifting allegiances, fractured loyalties, and raw brutality. Chroniclers of the era penned a lasting summary: Christ and his saints slept. At first, Stephen appeared competent. He reaffirmed royal liberties and distributed patronage generously to secure allies, but cracks soon showed. His conciliatory approach to powerful nobles backfired spectacularly when his leniency allowed them to increase their own private armies and expand their castles. The very barons who had once feared Henry's strict rule now found themselves unchecked in Stephen's permissive reign. In 1138, Matilda and Robert of Gloucester launched a military campaign to reclaim the crown. Landing in the West Country, they raised an army of loyalists and established their stronghold in the fortress city of Gloucester. War began in earnest. Castles were besieged, villages razed, and entire regions fell into lawless ruin. The struggle was not merely military, it was ideological. Matilda presented herself as the rightful monarch, one whose claim had been unfairly usurped. Stephen, meanwhile, declared he had taken the throne for stability's sake, arguing that his rule was God's will. Both sides began issuing rival documents, forging contradictory alliances with regional lords, and pulling the kingdom in opposite directions. In 1141, the scales tipped dramatically. In February of that year at the Battle of Lincoln, King Stephen was captured by Robert of Gloucester's forces. He was imprisoned at Bristol Castle. For a moment it seemed as if Matilda would finally realize the promise her father had forged years earlier. She rode into London in triumph. Royal writs were issued in her name. She was, by right and recognition, Lady of the English. But Matilda's victory was short-lived. London, ever opportunistic, turned on her. Her pride, inherited from royal blood and imperial upbringing, clashed with the expectations of the English elite. She imposed heavy taxes, brushed aside noble counsel, and acted more as empress than queen regnant. Her enemies painted her as haughty and foreign. Just as she prepared for coronation, a mob rose against her in rebellion. Matilda fled the city. The tides turned once more when Robert of Gloucester was captured in Winchester later the same year. An exchange was made. The king for the night. Stephen was freed, and with him, the second phase of the Civil War began. What followed was a slow and grinding stalemate. No side held enough ground to deal a killing blow. No peace held long enough to last. England descended into fragmented rule. Nobles built unlicensed castles known as adulterine strongholds. Whole tracts of countryside were dominated by petty warlords. Towns were sacked, crops burned. The legal and bureaucratic apparatus Henry had built was left to rot beneath the ruins of disputed kingship. Even the church, Henry's once loyal ally, became divided. Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury remained neutral. Bishops hedged their bets. Rome sent ambiguous messages. Meanwhile, the common people, taxed heavily by whomever held their region, suffered deeply. "The earth bare no corn," wrote one chronicler of the time, for the land was all destroyed by such deeds, and men said openly that Christ slept. Both Matilda and Stephen grew weary. Politics had evolved into attrition. Strategy became survival. Slowly, a new possibility emerged. Henry Fitz-Empress, Matilda's son, now a teenager, was coming of age. In 1153, after years of inconclusive warfare, the boy landed in England. Known later as Henry II, he brought with him new hope for a more permanent resolution. Even some of Stephen's allies, now sickened by endless chaos, began shifting loyalties to the boy. But before the question could again come to arms, Stephen experienced a personal catastrophe. His own son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly in August 1153. Grief-stricken and without a strong successor, Stephen agreed to terms of peace known as the Treaty of Winchester. The treaty declared that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry, Matilda's son, would succeed him upon death. With that agreement, the anarchy drew to a close. When Stephen died the following year in 1154, Henry of Anjou became King of England as Henry II, ushering in the powerful Plantagenet dynasty. Matilda, though never crowned queen herself, would be remembered as the mother of kings, and Henry I's bloodline would once again sit upon the throne. Yet the scars of this conflict ran deep. In his desperate bid to preserve order, Henry I had controlled every detail of rule except the most fragile element of all, succession. In balancing modern governance with medieval politics, law with inheritance, he had redrawn the duties of a king. But his death had revealed the brittleness beneath. Anarchy had proven one unshakable truth, that without unity even the strongest kingdom could splinter into chaos. King Henry I died in 1135. His body laid to rest in the abbey he founded at Reading, but his spirit, methodical, relentless and reformist, lived on in every courtroom, treasury and royal hall he left behind. History would remember him not as a conqueror or crusader, but as a ruler who reshaped what it meant to govern. He was Beauclerc, the fine scholar, an epithet that might seem quaint beside kings nicknamed the Great or the Lion Heart. Yet in England's long constitutional journey, no title may be more significant. Few monarchs of the medieval age governed with such sustained control or attention to detail. Henry's reign was defined not by glorious military campaigns or sweeping religious vision, but by the slow building of a more functional and centralized state. In his hands, the kingdom became less the personal fief of a warlord and more a governmental structure, an entity that could survive bad harvests, changing courts, and even interregna. Perhaps Henry's greatest legacy was his ability to see the monarchy as more than just his person. Under Beauclerc, the king became the head of an institution. The exchequer, royal writs, itinerant judges, and pipe rolls were not merely innovations. They were early blueprints of a bureaucracy that would oversee a nation rather than merely dominate it. His financial reforms, notably his streamlining of the exchequer, allowed the crown to monitor income and expenditure with unprecedented precision. His coinage maintained stability amid times of upheaval. These measures enhanced the monarchy's solvency and independence, allowing the king to operate without the constant need for baronial subsidies or church favour. Just as importantly, Henry saw the value in professionalizing royal service. He surrounded himself with clerks and new men, loyal administrators not by birth but by talent. This meritocratic impulse broke from continental norms and set a precedent later kings would continue. It created perhaps the earliest version of a civil service, long before that concept had a name. But Henry's systems were more than just practical. they were weapons. They consolidated power squarely in royal hands. His justice reforms delivered judgments with sweeping reach. His use of the law as a unifying force allowed him to undermine feudal fragmentation without raising a sword. For commoners and knights alike, Henry's court became the final word, not just in policy but in life and limb. Though feared, he was often respected for his consistency. Still, the iron grip had its costs. His legacy suffers, fairly or unfairly, from the long interregnum that followed his death. The White Ship disaster, and what some saw as Henry's hubris in demanding his daughter succeed him, plunged the kingdom into nearly 2 decades of war. To critics, his legacy is tarnished by that failure, proof that for all his intellect and reforms, he could not secure the only outcome kings were judged by, an undisputed succession. Yet viewed through a wider lens, one can argue that Henry's greatest contribution was not the heir he failed to maintain, but the immovable idea of kingship he left behind. In ruling as a government, not simply a patriarch, Henry redefined sovereignty. Before him, reigns rose and fell with the strength of a king's arm or the allure of his chivalry. After him, kings came to be measured, for better or worse, by their ability to govern, to audit, to administer, to judge. These were not glamorous duties, but they would become the pillars of modern monarchy. Neither sainted nor reviled, Henry occupies a more complex place in English memory. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle ends during his reign, perhaps befitting a monarch caught between the old and new. To his contemporaries, he was feared. Order under Henry could be harsh and punishment severe. Royal justice was swift and unyielding, yet there remained undercurrents of admiration, even affection. Chroniclers respected his ability to hold peace when others brought war, and hold peace he did, decisively. Despite serious rivalries with Robert Curthose and tension with restive barons, England itself remained largely stable during Henry's rule. By diffusing insurrections with a mix of diplomacy and calculated force, he preserved an internal calm that greatly strengthened the kingdom after the upheavals of the conquest. Compared to the brutal chaos that followed after his death, the anarchy, his era shimmered with a cold but reliable peace. Henry's legacy also lived on quite literally through his progeny. His daughter Matilda never wore the crown, true, but her son would become Henry II, founder of England's greatest medieval dynasty, the Angevins or Plantagenets. The institutions built by Henry I gave his grandson a powerful platform upon which to construct his legal empire. The similarities between grandfather and grandson are no coincidence. Order, law, bureaucracy, and control mark them both. Henry's mountain of acknowledged illegitimate children, estimated between 20 and 25, also left their imprint. Through strategic marriages and alliances, these children helped Henry forge the vast web of influence he used to underpin his rule. Many of them held high office, climbed into noble ranks, and cemented the connections necessary for long-term royal power. He also left behind symbols, castles renovated and expanded as instruments of central power, abbeys endowed to reflect piety and legacy. Even his burial at Reading Abbey, a now lost tomb that once stood tall, was a monument to the era of order he envisioned. Destroyed during the English Reformation, the tomb's disappearance only enhances the myth that Henry's body may have perished, but the monarchy he reimagined endured. In the end, Henry Beauclerc was not the flashiest of monarchs, nor the most beloved. His legacy rests not in a battlefield victory or a holy relic, but in the bones of bureaucracy, in ledgers, in laws, in letters issued under royal seal. He lacked the knightly glamour later monarchs would cultivate, but he possessed something greater, enduring relevance. He closed the gap between the ancient and medieval, between conquest and kingship, between personal rule and public office. Through him, the monarchy became not only a family inheritance, but a state, an institution meant to outlive its maker. And in that the scholar king succeeded completely.